we are going to look at county lines, but inside of that we're going to look at gangs, because that's how county lines' main mode of operation works. We're also going to look at CSE, because actually CSE is a main element of what happens within county lines, and I'm going to tie it back to legislation for you in terms of what legislation we can use in terms of actually securing convictions. So that's looking at the modern day slavery legislation, also looking at criminal legislation in terms of criminal acts, and community legislation as well. So looking at things like closure orders for things like trap houses. Okay, so if I could ask you just to put in the chat now what you are actually hoping to get out of today's session, that would be really helpful. I'll give you all a couple of minutes to do that. Claire, CSE is child sexual exploitation.
Thank you.
So Suzanne, yeah, it is. It's about being confident when having those discussions with learners, definitely. It's about having an understanding of kind of what they've gone through, their experience, their journey. And unfortunately, nowadays, drugs is a big part of young people's lives. There's a lot of drug taking, unfortunately, has been normalised. In terms of use of things like cannabis. It's not seen as this sort of gateway drug anymore, whereas the evidence does actually show us that it is that gateway drug. We do know that young people who start using cannabis will, a majority of them will go on to experience other substances, but it's also opening them up to that sort of experience of criminality and exposing them to that exploitation. So yeah, definitely, totally see about the confidence and wanting to be able to speak to your learners. Hopefully, Lorraine, yes, I can give you some more knowledge, and hopefully the resources will be able to help you go away, have a look and underpin that knowledge. And yeah, definitely, please do plagiarise it. Yeah, Megan, you can adapt this session for your staff or for your apprentices. Actually, it's really quite a good one for apprentices, because they're out in the community. They might actually be, you know, in a position to actually report to the police if there is criminal activity, especially if you're looking at health and social care apprentices, for example. They may be working with parents or children who may be at risk of cuckooing. So there's definitely great resources here for you to be able to take and be able to develop and use with your learners and your staff. So let's get started. So what we are going to look at today, we're looking at what we term as the exploitation methods that are used by gangs to basically supply drugs. It's a drug supply network called county lines. We're going to first look at the vulnerabilities which people look for exploitation. Can I just say that this isn't just necessarily exploitation in terms of county lines. Anyone who's looking to exploit a child, a vulnerable person, or an adult, you know, they look at these things anyway. They will take bits of that to kind of manipulate that person for their own ends. We're going to look at some specific indicators that you will see evidenced by children and young people that are actually specific to county lines. And these are quite good when you're trying to identify whether a young person is actually involved in a county line or is just being exploited in terms of, you know, drugs. In County Durham, we don't really have a huge problem with county lines. We have very static drug supplies in terms of how drugs come into the county. However, we have seen that starting to increase in terms of cocaine and crack and heroin being moved in. There's been a big case in Darlington where they have closed the line down. However, we are starting to see predominantly Albanians controlling the increase in drug supply into the region, and through violence trying to close down those long-term drug dealing families that we've had predominantly within the County Durham area. Near the end of the session, I'm going to take you through commonly used terminology. So if you're, you know, in the corridors in your college, or, you know, you're walking around, you will be able to identify some of the language that these young people might be using. And that'll help you identify whether, you know, they're just talking generically about drugs, about, you know, getting a 20 bag or whatever it is that they're doing. But if they're talking about some language around going country, etc., you'll be able to identify that, and that would be an alert for you to think, I've got to take this down a safeguarding route. So, county lines is a serious and growing safeguarding issue. No one really knows how many children and young people are involved in county lines. However, across all 44 police forces across England, they reported county lines activity in 2019. It's estimated that there are over 2,000 county lines across England that are in operation, and within a single year, they're capable of making £800,000 profit per year. And we're seeing this grow, and the reason for that is because they are exploiting younger children to carry the drugs. And we're also seeing that they're changing the way that they target. So previously, when we looked at county lines, it was predominantly children and young people from areas where there was deprivation, and it was easy to attract those young people, either because they were around an area where there were gangs, or there were from such an area of deprivation that the thought of making easy money and being targeted that way by gifts or by cash, that was attractive to them. However, we're now seeing a much more sort of refined operation by the people who are operating the county lines. They are now actually, you know, targeting middle class sort of children and young people, and the age is reduced. So before you were looking at 14 upwards, now we're looking at children as young as 11 being targeted for county lines exploitation. It's a changing situation all the time. It's fluid, it moves, because as soon as they are kind of found out in one situation, they will move very quickly. And it's based on, the county lines model is almost based on the gig economy that we have around the UK. It's the drug dealers are very clever. They've taken that gig economy model, and basically it's Deliveroo, but it's Deliveroo for drugs rather than it being, you know, your takeaway. So when we look at criminal exploitation of children and vulnerable adults, it is a geographically widespread form of harm. It's in every borough, it's in every county, it's across the whole of the UK. And it basically, criminal exploitation occurs where individuals or groups are going to take advantage of an imbalance of power, and they want that power to basically coerce or control or manipulate a young person or a child or a vulnerable adult to make money for them. The victims, you know, it might appear that they've been willing participants in this exploitation, They just don't understand that actually they have been exploited. And we find this a lot around young women who are the partners or the boyfriend or girlfriend of these people. They feel that in order to get the love or the support that they have to do this. And it doesn't always involve, the physical. We are seeing that County Lines is using technology more and more. It's a dedicated phone line that they use. That is the County Line. But we're seeing the recruitment of the children and young people through games. So, for example, there's an article out this week where they've been using Fortnite to recruit children for County Lines. But County Lines, they're using Instagram. They're showing people with large amounts of money, lots of goods, to try and attract more young people in, to be able to kind of call them to this almost lifestyle. So, gone too far there. So when we look at vulnerabilities, there are several layers of vulnerabilities that those who wish to exploit will actually look at. For that child or that individual, if a child or young person is in the looked after system, they are at higher risk of being pulled into a County Line or being exploited, and we've got lots and lots of evidence to show that now. But it may be that that young person may have learning difficulties. We've seen a lot of convictions for young people who have spectrum disorders who have been drawn into County Lines, and that they're using that ability to not think the way that non-neurotypical children think, to be able to exploit them. For a lot of young people on the spectrum, they just want to have a friend, and they think that this person is being their friend. And we actually had a case in college where we had a young man who had Asperger's, and the people who were grooming him were giving him little bits of cannabis, and he wasn't actually selling drugs. What they actually did was they cuckooed his bank account. So they used his bank account to put thousands and thousands of pounds through, to take it from being dirty money to being clean money. So we see that exploitation happening more and more with young people who are non-neurotypical. But it may be, that the young person might have substance misuse themselves and actually have got debts to drug dealers, and they're given this as a way out of actually reducing their debt, or that they're trying to pay the debt off. Unfortunately, the young person in that case usually ends up stuck in debt bondage. So they're stuck to that drug dealer, continually paying that debt off. From my point of view, I think the very nature of being somebody who's under 18 automatically classes them as vulnerable. They haven't got, the skills as even some adults, in terms of seeing when something's dangerous, or understanding the thought processes between managing and understanding risk. So I think that from my point of view, I always look at anybody under the age of 18, that they're automatically vulnerable because they don't have the skills that adults do. And I know as part of FE, it's our job to prepare them to be adults. But sometimes there are some children and young people who have had such a bad start, whether it be toxic trios or coming from the care system or whatever, that they just do not have that skill base to be able to make those decisions for themselves. So, and these exploiters are very good at picking these children and young people out, and adults that are vulnerable as well. So moving on to our homes and families, if we've got a child or a young person who's coming from a home or a family where there is neglect or abuse, or they've had exposure or experience of parental violence or substance abuse. Even just a lack of a relationship with a protective, nurturing adult themselves can actually make that person vulnerable. If you look at certain areas around the country, and especially at the moment, there are children and young people out until all hours of the night. Like literally in Brixton last night, there was a free party. A lot of the young people there were under the age of 18. Now we're still kind of in lockdown, so what's happening there in terms of parental responsibility? Where's the kind of boundaries for those children and those young people? So that protective adult situation may not be there for a lot of them. So if you haven't got that protective adult, they're not going to see the signs of that young person being groomed for exploitation, because that adult is too busy dealing with whatever their own issues are, or are just letting that child do what they want to do. Next, we've got peers, and peers are the main influence in young people's lives. They do stop at a certain point listening to their parents. But if that young person is exposed to other young people who are known to be exploited or are exploiters themselves, there is more likelihood that that child or that young person is going to be recruited into an abusive situation, be it a county line or be it sexual exploitation or other forms of criminal exploitation. And we see this very much so in a gang structure. Peers will recruit other peers to a gang. Then we've got our schools and colleges. And the biggest risk within this group is those children and young people that are NEET and who are from pupil referral units. We have a lot of empirical evidence that shows that these county line operators are targeting pupil referral units. And we all know how hard it is to keep a child and a young person in a PRU to come to class. If they're being given an alternative opportunity where they see that they're going to make lots of money and get the best trainers and have the best phones and all the rest of it, they're going to pick that as their outlet rather than it being, the traditional route of go to college, get a job. Yeah, Katrina, you're right. Sometimes it is as simple as someone giving them the attention that they've never had before. And that is frightening, because a lot of children and young people, and predominantly from single parent families, that might be the first positive role model that young person's actually ever had in their life. And if they think that they're a positive role model, they will follow through on what they're being asked from that person. And finally, we've got our neighbourhoods. And unfortunately, if you're born in a certain area, you are more likely to be exposed to gangs, drugs, violent crime. If you've got, if you're born in an area that has high deprivation, or you are in a known gang area, then the outcomes for that young person are much lower than, if you're born in a rural area where you've got a supportive community around you and there is affluence. And that's a difficult one, because trying to raise aspirations for children and young people in those areas is really hard when they've got all of this surrounding them. So as educators, it's about us hopefully offering them the alternative and showing them what they can do and what we can help support them to achieve. So looking at who is vulnerable to exploitation. So both males and females are being exploited within county lines. It's predominantly males, but we are now seeing that actually we've seen in the past year a 20% increase in females being exploited. As I said, young people from care backgrounds are more at risk, especially those that have got interrupted care histories or they've been moved around the country. And for a lot of young people, actually being taken off their parents and put into care is actually what the exploiters want, because it means that they can make their county line much further, because they might take a child from, say, Tower Hamlets and move them all the way up to Doncaster or move them all the way down to Devon. That's setting up a new supply route for that county line. And those who've had an experience of neglect, physical or sexual abuse, Class A drug users or addiction, you know, it's easy to get those young people or those adults into debt bondage because they have an addiction. Mental health, it's, you know, unfortunately that these people do like to actually target people with mental health issues because they are very easily persuaded. It's that attention, it's that support, it's that nurture. Physical and learning disabilities. So as I said earlier, you know, we've seen an increase in non-neurotypical young people being targeted. People who are already involved in gangs, homelessness or insecure accommodation status, nobody's keeping an eye on them. So it's easy to use and manipulate these young people. Economic vulnerability, if you've come from a background where your parents have been on benefits all your life and you've never had those nice things, and someone's coming along saying, well, here's a wad of money, if you do this for me, you'll be able to get what you want, then they will use that. The other thing is that what we find as well is that these people who are exploiting children and young people in terms of county lines show them a different value to money. So what they do is they will say, well, if your mum had a job, for example, they'll ask how much does she earn, and then they would basically show the child or young person that value in cash and say, this is what I've made this month. So they devalue the young person's ideas around work and about, you know, the usefulness in society. They take that economic vulnerability so that they can exploit it. And as I said previously, not being in mainstream education and particularly attending a pro, my concern is always, if somebody's under 19, what are they doing? So if they're not in education, what are they doing all day? And that, for me, is a flag straight away. So when we look at the indicators in terms of county lines, there are some key things that we would look for that would be flags for us to start looking at safeguarding. So if they were frequently missing or they were being found out of the area, if they're being, you know, if you're going in and you're finding large quantities of drugs or weapons or evidence of, you know, things like cling film, drug bags, scales, that kind of thing. If there's unexplained amounts of money, mobile phones that you've not seen before, especially, you know, pay-as-you-go phones, because that's what they use for county lines. They don't use, you know, posh phones. It is literally a burner phone. They may have credit on things like Amazon or, you know, those kind of companies where you can pay before, you can top things up. Clothing or jewellery where you know you haven't bought them, they've just kind of turned up. Being found out of the area when they've been reported missing or they're arrested out of the area. They might be returning from those missing episodes with injuries, or they're dishevelled, or they just haven't been, they've not washed, their clothes are dirty, they smell. Looking at, you know, behavioural changes, so they're starting to become, and this one's a really difficult one because, as we know, teenagers do this. anyway, they do become secretive, and they do drop hobbies. But it's the self-isolation from their peers that they had before, not mixing with their usual friends, and their unexplained absences from education. And as for us, if a student's missing a lot of class, we have things in place to flag it. That's one of those questions that we need to be asking kind of with the student. They may become increasingly disruptive or hostile or physically aggressive. And you might see a change in the language that they're using. It may be more sexualized, more drug related, or it may be like gang language or talking about violence. A lot of young people have a change in the music they're listening to. So they change over to something called drill music, which is quite violent rap. You'll see an increase in them wanting to make money, and a change in what they understand the value of worth is. And the one for me is, these groomers are really clever, and what they can do, if that young person has a parent who is, inquisitive and concerned for their child, the exploiters may, encourage the young person to make false allegations towards adults in the home of physical or sexual abuse, because, as I said before, for the groomers, actually, the best case scenario for them is that that young person's taken into care, because then the watchful eyes of the parents are taken off them. And actually, I attended a training course in London where a very high up senior official in the UK Borders Agency, her son had been a victim of grooming in terms of that, and her son actually made an allegation of sexual abuse against his father, and the father had to be taken out of the home. And this is a very, educated woman who understands the law. And even in that situation, she was powerless to what her son was saying about the father in the home, so that he could be taken out. And he'd been manipulated by the groomers to make these allegations. So there is evidence to show that. And as I said, it makes that the groomers then have free access to that child.
Sarah, just on that point you've made, I think that's really critical. There's a real sort of ability to other. This must be other families that this happens to. This must be other people who don't live like I live. But what that person you went to London has shown, that if you're brave enough to say this has happened to you, and so that everyone else can start to relate to this issue, the worst thing that can ever happen is we start to see a two-tier society where those people that get involved with this are over there, and then this would never happen to my children. I think we need to hear more stories like this across the country, more people who are brave enough to come out and say, I did everything right, I love my kids, I was there for them, and this happened to me too. Because I think there's going to be people hiding this, feeling the shame that as a parent this has been their fault, and what you're saying now is that it can happen to anyone.
Yeah, definitely, Claire. We are seeing much more young people from middle class, well brought up young people who are being drawn into this form of exploitation. And yeah, you're right, we need less middle class parents to sweep it under the carpet and to actually come out and say this has happened, especially in terms of, we do that, there is that polarization, isn't there, in society, and we do kind of put the blinkers on and think it is just the children and young people from this area, and it's not anymore. We're seeing increase in violence in areas that are, very well off, typically traditionally well parented, good grammar school kind of children, young people who are being drawn in. Because before obviously COVID, if you saw a young person on a train who, you know, had his Adidas jogging bottoms on and his North Face jacket and all the rest of it, he would be more likely to be stopped and searched. Where if you saw the young man, you know, in his grammar school uniform reading Dickens on the train, for example, the police aren't going to stop and ask him any questions. So that's why they are looking to target these more middle class young children and young people.
Good Lord. Yeah, and the other thing is we're living in a time when so many people can feel disenfranchised from society. So you know, so you've got somebody in the family as a carer, feel they haven't been looked after through COVID. They're not paid the right amount. Carers aren't paid enough for what they do. It's hideous how we treat our care assistants in our society. The fact that we might say this is against the law, that's just going to fall on deaf ears. This is a system that's never felt like it works for you and your family. So why would you listen to any comment about this not being lawful? That's not going to sway you at all, is it? It's a really super complex society-wide issue, and our challenge in education is that we can't address wages and the gig economy and all the unfairness that surrounds so many families. It's tough. And is there an extent where cross services are coming together and saying, how can we help on so many different levels? Do you see those cross coming together?
Not, unfortunately, not in the northeast. We are seeing changes in Yorkshire. So the St Giles Trust have set up in Yorkshire. They're predominantly working in Leeds. They are working in Manchester and Humberside and London. They are a specific organisation who look at exploitation in terms of county lines and gangs holistically. So they are much more about supporting the young person to get out of those systems that are in place and to leave gangs. They're a great charity. I cannot, you know, speak highly enough of them. However, that is only, they only have so much funding, and unfortunately, given what we're dealing with now, my concern is that a lot of those agencies, those charitable organisations, are really going to struggle moving forward. That and, you know, the diversionary activities that charities are able to fund. You know, youth clubs have been closed since March. That those interactions with those young people aren't happening at the moment unless you've got a really dedicated youth worker or a really dedicated DSL in a college, or, you know, who's working absolutely make sure these children and young people are all right. And unfortunately, you're right, Claire, you know, we're in a situation where some of these families, they may be, you know, mum is a carer and she's been reduced, she's had her wages reduced, or she's, you know, been on statutory sick pay because she's had COVID. And for that young person, that might be the only way they can turn to actually make any money to help out in the house. And there is still a notion of some people who still think when somebody is 16, they have to go out and get a job and they have to pay their way in the house. So for them, that's an easy way to do it. And when we look at grooming, and this can be, you know, applied to not just county lines, it can be applied to grooming across the board, whether it be, you know, in terms of sexual exploitation, or grooming in terms of, you know, preparing a child or a young person for radicalisation. We can look at these across the board. So when we look at grooming, it's the process of establishing that emotional bond with a vulnerable young person or child because they want to exploit them for something. Any kind of exploitative behaviour is considered grooming. And we usually find that the person or the groomer is paying a lot of attention to that young person. And because of that, they develop this, the young person will develop a perception that that person is of high status. Hence why we see a lot of single parent families, that male role model situation. As I said, the technique is usually accompanied by an attempt to isolate that young person, whether it's their friends, whether it's their family, whether it's, you know, in terms of us as staff in a college or a school. They want to basically take control, and it's usually coercive control. And they want to disempower that young person, and in some cases they infantilize the young person, and gangs act like a family for that young person. They tell them that they'll look after them, they've got their back, you know, or here's 20 quid, you get them, you know, or here's these trainers you wanted, or we'll get you a bike, you know, because you've not got one. They act as a parent and a family. So the older members of the gang are seen as the parents, the protectors. The younger ones that are on the same level as them are seen as, you know, their peers, their friends, their brothers and sisters. And that is why gangs are so good at manipulating young people. They basically, the best way I can describe it is, in terms of county lines, they sell children and young people a lifestyle. It's, you know, the clothes, the watches, the trainers, and it is brainwashing that young person into the gang's way of thinking. You know, they coach the child to be secretive. They make sure that that young person only trusts them. They also, more importantly, you know, they install hatred of the police as a technique for manipulation. And the reason they do that is because it means that the young person is less likely to ask for help. Authority is seen as bad. Police are seen as bad. Social workers are seen as bad. Educators are seen as bad. And they do that to disempower and disenfranchise that young person, so that they won't attempt to leave or access services to get them out of that situation. Normally, when we look at grooming, recruiters will normally, or previous, would have targeted a quieter child, or possibly a child who was following a gang but wasn't a gang member. And they would treat them with respect, and they'd look after them, and that would basically mean that they became the male role model. Where you've got parents who did care, the groomers will, you know, tell the child or the young person that they're bothersome or they're nagging you, and they do take mental capacity into account when they are manipulating that child or that young person. So moving on, when we talk about a gang, well, we've had gangs for a very, very long time. You know, for over 2,000 years, they've been part of history. Cicero complained about being harassed by street gangs in ancient Rome. In the 1700s and 1950s, we had 40 Elephants, who were women's shoplifting gang who operated in London. Got a nice picture of Cillian Murphy there on the screen for you all, for our Peaky Blinder fans there. You know, they were in the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, they were a gang in Birmingham who basically had organised crime. We've all heard of the Krays. They controlled organised crime and street gangs in the 1960s and 70s in London. As it currently stands, the majority of cocaine in the UK is basically ran by Albanian gangs. And the problem with Albanian gangs is that, you know, when you had maybe 10 years ago, drug wars, so one drug dealer was invading on another patch, there'd be a bit of a rough up. These Albanian gangs have an extreme violent side. They are quite happy to, you know, get others to do their bidding, to carry out serious violence, and hence why we see the increase in knife crime that we have at the moment, and also in terms of the amount of young people, unfortunately, who have been murdered as a result of gang violence. I don't know whether you're aware of a group in London that are called the Marley Boys. They control the London boroughs of E10 and E17. They control all the drug operations in there. They were originally a gang who were from Somalia. However, they have now extended that, so they take anybody who does their initiation. They're very, very violent gang. They were responsible for murdering the 14-year-old in London who was murdered on his scooter. And so we're seeing, sorry, Patrina?
I was just going to say, I read something relatively recently that said one of the differences between gangs going through history is the fact that gangs, say, of the past had a certain, certainly not Robin Hood, but where they looked after their local community.
Yeah.
And even the Craig twins would look after the local community. I get the feeling, and I'm just sort of checking out really, that today we don't have that sort of relationship with where they're from. It's just, you know, the violence and the atrocities are just greater, and that actually there's no love for anyone, or there's no respect, or there's no even sort of agreements that go on in terms of how they will look after people or whatever.
Yeah, that's right, Patrina. Yeah, that previously there was almost an honour code.
Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. Yeah.
However, now, no, it's about how much money I can make, how much territory can I take over, how far can I spread my network. And let's be honest, it's not the kids at the bottom that are really making the money. They're not having the benefit of what they're doing. This is going up to your organised crime guys at the very top.
Yeah.
It's almost an accountability. I was just going to write in chat. I remember my mum was working for Greater London Council where they had to rehouse people on the Isle of Dogs. Her job was to rehouse the crazed mum. And she said, you know, there was a certain fear when they walked into the office to discuss the housing and things, but it was a very clear accountability. That was the family that was doing it. Now, we talk about quite nebulous gangs now. I know you've given some examples, but we wouldn't all know who that is in our area, whereas perhaps in the past with the Peaky Blinders and others, that was known. You knew who it was, and perhaps if they did break that code, there would be consequences within the community. It's a very different world now, isn't it? And
very much clear that accountability is gone, and that you know, this is my area. That doesn't really exist anymore, especially in terms of county lines. In terms of the areas, I think in London, you are still seeing certain areas being controlled by postcode, but that's more to do with the way that the housing is in London rather than it being, you know, if you look at rural County Durham, it's very, very different scenario. But because you have those high tower sort of, you know, if you look at the barrier block at Brixton, for example, there will be so many people in there that will be one particular gang. There won't be any derivation from that gang. Whereas if you move over E17 at Walthamstow, you know, that is very much controlled by the Marley Boys. I have to say the Marley Boys are looking to take over the other areas, but it can be as simple as walking from one side of a street in London to the other, where you've gone from one gang territory to another. It is that, you know, tight in terms of who controls what where. And that's why we see, you know, unfortunately, a lot of innocent young people being killed because they haven't had the understanding of going from one side of the street to the other. And that, for me, that lawlessness, there are areas where I think that the police do get concerned about going to because of the levels of violence related to gangs in those areas, definitely.
You remember that book a few years ago called Freakonomics, and it would explain to a young person how working for this amount of money over the years is actually not as attractive as it might be shown. There was quite a lot of work done in trying to deprogram people about the idea that quick money is actually going to last you for your lifetime. And have we still got access to resources which can help us to unpick some of that programming, and perhaps in sessions like financial literacy, acknowledging that this might just be a tiny step towards helping somebody? I think as teachers we will never be able to do that in its entirety, but is there access to that kind of knowledge anymore about how to unpick those misconceptions that people can have?
Yeah, I think there is, Claire. Yeah, definitely. I think that, you know, there are some resources that I'm going to share after the session, but definitely, you know, the simple financial one is easy. You know, if you look at the long-term health consequences for some of the young people who are involved either in the violence or in taking substances themselves, and they're making money from it, it's quite easy to show that the health impact means that, you know, you won't be able to do that. What happens if, you know, you are stabbed and you can't do that anymore, and you can't even work? This is what your life will look like on benefits. So you can use the resources that are out there to kind of show what those outcomes are for young people. And one of the resources that I've got for you, there's case studies in there that you can use with children and young people to show them the outcomes for those. And it actually, in quite a few of the case studies, shows you how they were groomed. So they identify the techniques that were used for those young people and be sucked into that exploitative relationship. So,
can I just ask a general question? Yeah. It's to the others who are participating along the lines of, are you conscious in your own organisations of this happening? Or is it sort of, you know of it, but you're not necessarily seeing it?
I think we're seeing it more and more, Katrina. I think over the past couple of years, I've referred quite a number of students over to safeguarding, just purely because we've identified some of these things coming up. So I think we are seeing more and more of it, yes, definitely. But I think we're also getting better at identifying it quickly. So
Yeah.
whether it's always been there, but because we do have that awareness now, we're picking up on it. I'm unsure, however, we are seeing more. Mm-hmm.
In terms of, and again going back to Sarah's point, that it's not always the what you would perceive as the most vulnerable in terms of where they're from, family circumstances and what have you. Are you seeing that in North Tyneside as well?
I think the majority of the students who we have passed on for safeguarding, they tend to be the looked after children, neat. So yes, I am seeing that. Not so much of the sort of middle class. It tends to be students from areas of deprivation that we are seeing are being targeted. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Megan, what about for you?
Similar, I think. We've heard stories of just little pockets. We don't have a big gang culture in Newcastle, but little pockets of, you know, like exploitation and things like that. And again, it's the deprived areas, I believe. But that's sort of why I'm on here, to find out a bit more about what is happening out there, because I'm sort of removed from it all. I don't deal with students directly. and only if I dip into E&D sort of sessions would I hear about it. So I'm kind of a bit removed from it all, which obviously I don't want to be ignorant to it all. That's why I'm in this one.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, right. Thanks. Anybody else? I don't know. Right. Okay. Sorry, I've interrupted you. I am conscious, Sarah, that some people might be needing to stretch their legs a little bit because of the.
Shall we have a 5-minute comfort break? Yeah.
That might be an idea. If we say just literally, it's 5 to 11. If we just say back in your seat at 11, is that okay?
Brilliant. We'll see you in 5 minutes.
Yeah, super. Thank you.
See you in a minute, and I'll pause the recording as well, so I will inevitably forget to unpause it. So Patrina, can you help me remember?
Yeah.
We kind of had a look at what vulnerabilities we were looking at in terms of targeting for groomers. We had a look at sort of what indicators we could see for children and young people that may alert us to the fact that they might be part of a county line or being victims of exploitation. So we're going to have a quick look now at gangs and gang hierarchy. So a gang is actually defined in law. It's Section 51 of the Serious Crimes Act, which was brought into legislation in 2015. And it was basically enacted so that the courts could grant injunctions to stop gang-related violence and drug dealing activities. However, it's very, very basic. So it basically says a group that consists of 3 or more members and has 1 or more characteristics that enables its members to be identified by others as a group. So if we were at our PD North meetup and we were all together, we could be the PD North gang. Because we have aims and objectives. We have things that we want to do. The good thing is that we're not interested in gang-related violence or drug dealing. We're about supporting and progressing learners. However, the statutory guidance was basically brought around to be able to allow agencies to apply for an injunction, and those injunctions could be used to break up the gangs or to set out what it meant by gang-related violence. However, it is a really complex task for anybody bringing that case, because the nature and the form of gang-related violence varies very, very differently from area to area. And unfortunately, sometimes it's not captured by a single definition or a single explanation. So the legislation was intentionally drawn from a wide background to allow the courts to be able to grant those injunctions, because it is an evolving and ever-changing form of criminality. Unfortunately, as I said, that definition basically meant that if you've got 5 kids all from one college stood at a bus stop, they could be classed as a gang member at some point. And especially if in certain areas they're in a certain postcode area, or they're from a certain ethnic minority, or they're from, you know, a certain area, then that could be used to specify those children or young people or adults as a gang at that point. So a gang is a relatively durable and predominantly street-based group of people. Yeah, they see themselves as a discernible group. There's something that ties them together, and that might be their postcode area, it might be, you know, their cultural heritage or their ethnicity, or it may be, you know, that they live in a certain area and pull others in from that. And they identify and lay claim to territory. So for example, with the Mali boys, we see that they control E10 and E17. And they have an identifying structural feature, and we're going to look at that in a moment. and we'll find that they're in conflict with other gangs or similar gangs in terms of what that gang is operating. But even this, it's not a very sophisticated definition in terms of trying to kind of put a cover all across what we mean by a gang. So when we look at gang hierarchy, there are levels within that gang hierarchy. So at the bottom, we have what we call affiliates. These are usually, you know, family members, it might be school friends, it might be girlfriends or past friends, people that they can use that won't necessarily be asked to sell drugs in terms of county lines, but they may be used in terms of moving drugs or storing or hiding drugs, but not just drugs. It could be money, it could be weapons, it could even be people. In some cases, you know, female friends are exploited in terms of, you know, believing that they are actually the girlfriend or the partner of the gang member. And we kind of sit within there things that are called baby mamas. So this is someone who a gang member has a child with, and they'll use that relationship to exploit that person. Next, we've got what we call teenies. These are generally children under the age of 10. And there's a reason for that. It's because if they're under 10, it means that they're under the age of criminal responsibility. So the gangs are quite clever in manipulating this age group, and they are basically used to carry drugs and cash. They tend not to be given weapons. Unfortunately, this group are one of the main groups at risk of CSE due to what we call packing or plugging, and that's basically where they insert drugs either anally or vaginally into the children to use them to be carried round. Next on there, we've got what we would call runners or shooters or soldiers. So these are the people on the ground, and they will control the teenies. And they're normally aged between 12 to 15 years, and they're used to move larger amounts of drugs between older gang members. Their responsibility for manning county lines, delivering deals of drugs, or street dealing. So there are certain places where you can go where it's quite easy to go and be in a certain street in a certain area, and you know that you will be able to purchase drugs from a young person. They are the group that are most likely to be forced or go missing and placed into what we call trap houses, which are basically houses that are used to sell drugs. The youngers or your soldiers or your shooters will have some level of authority. They will be expected to extort fear and violence against your teenies and your affiliates in terms of being able to control them or to get your teenies into what we would call debt bondage. So they will arrange for them to be robbed of their drugs, and then they're told that they have to pay the debt for what's been stolen off by selling more drugs. So they are caught in that continuous circle of what we call debt bondage. Next, we've got our elders and faces. So these are normally over 18 and are in charge of running the county line and the trap houses, and they are also responsible for finding a target for cuckooing and actually carrying out that grooming and exploitation for a cuckooed property or a cuckooed bank account. They deal in large-scale operations, so they are moving large amounts of normally Class A, so it's heroin, crack. We are seeing an increase in methamphetamine being moved by these groups of people as well, and also cannabis. And the reason that they're moving large amounts of cannabis is because a lot of the younger people, your youngers and soldiers or teenies, are actually using cannabis themselves. So it's a way of control of that group as well. And they will also, you know, have the ability to enact retribution or punishments against the children and younger people, in terms of sort of, you know, if they've failed, if they've lost the drugs or they've been robbed by another gang, for example, there will be a punishment. And unfortunately, we're seeing an increase in the use of rape as a form of punishment, both in young men and young women. In terms of looking at our organised criminal gangs, unfortunately, this group, they don't normally get caught for their crimes. Everybody else on that hierarchy are the ones that are seen as disposable. Yeah. They are seen as powerful, and they're the ones who make the large-scale profits. And they're a group who, you know, they quite probably are responsible for the import of drugs or manufacture of drugs. They will be distributing weapons. They may also be bringing people into the UK. So, for example, the trafficking of Vietnamese boys into work in cannabis factories. We've had quite a few high-profile modern-day slavery cases across County Durham where we have seen Vietnamese boys under 18. I think the youngest one found was 14. Where the police had gone and raided a cannabis factory and found these children working in awful circumstances. And as we saw with the Vietnamese people who died in the back of the lorry in Essex, some of them probably were destined to go and work in a cannabis factory alongside things like your nail bars and domestic servitude. But definitely some of them would have been sold into there as well. They also are responsible for moving young people around the country in terms of getting them to pay drug debts off via prostitution. So they will move them into brothels to work or areas where there is known sex workers to pay debts off as well. So that's our gang hierarchy. I've got a video, but I'm going to play this at the end just because it means I don't have to switch 3 screens all at once and it get all confusing. So when we look at the impact of county lines, we obviously have the impact on the individual, but we also have an impact on community and services. Yeah. So in terms of community and services, we see an increase in drug and violent crime, as well as other increases in other areas of criminality. And this obviously has a massive impact in terms of health and welfare services, but also increased demands on the police. We also see that through courts, councils will use what we call closure orders on properties. And that leads to, you know, areas becoming more and more deprived if you're taking, you know, houses that aren't being in circulation for normal population to live in and are being closed down and boarded up. When you drive through those areas, you can see what's going on quite quickly. In terms of increased pressure on health and welfare services, you know, we are seeing in certain pockets in the country, obviously an increased demand on detox services, but also health problems associated with Class A drug use. So we know the health consequences attached to things like using heroin or crack cocaine, mental health issues, but also in terms of welfare services, you know, there's an increased demand for children and young people having to be taken in care and also child protection orders being issued. So that increased demand on that service is also having an impact. In terms of the individuals who have been drawn into county lines, we obviously have issues around physical and emotional ill health. You know, in terms of violent crime, young people will be beaten, increase in knife crime, but also in that emotional ill health, to be on edge and anxious all the time, because if somebody's selling drugs, they are hyper alert to what's going on around them. To be in that state of fight or flight all the time, it does damage to your body over time. You start thinking that people are following you, you get kind of paranoia disorder. So there is an impact, not just physically, but on that young person's emotional health. We have a loss of education. So that young person, if they've been pulled out to go and work in a trap house, they may have periods where they haven't had any education whatsoever. It may be, you know, if you're taking an 11 or 12-year-old out of school to go and work in a trap house, that they may have no engagement for those first periods of secondary education. So to them, they don't understand the benefit of education. All they know is how to make money selling drugs. They may also have their own dependencies, so they may have a drug or alcohol addiction because that's what they're, you know, using as their coping method. That's how they're managing their stress. The other thing is that we see a massive shift in their perceptions of life and their approaches to deal with difficulties. They don't see themselves, you know, going down a traditional route of, you know, getting a qualification, getting a boyfriend or a girlfriend, having a house, getting a car, all those things that are milestones that we have. They don't see life like that. They see life as very, like, almost that it's finite, and that at any point it can be taken away, because around them they've seen that happen to their peers. Their approaches in dealing with difficulties, normally you will find that they will resort to aggression and violence rather than having those problem solving skills that we develop in those young people. And obviously, if they've been caught, they have a criminal record, which we know is a barrier for a lot of young people to get jobs. I don't know what you do for those of you who are working in colleges, but we are now at New College, every student has to disclose their criminal record. Is that happening at other colleges? Can you give me a thumbs up if you are doing that? No, just at New College. Oh, Paula is, yeah. Traditionally, we've just asked that for, you know, programs where they're going into placement, or it's a requirement of what they're going to be doing, but now it's applied to the whole of the college. And I have some concerns about that. You know, if you were 15 and you've been done for being drunk up the park, you know, it might just be a formal warning, but that might be a barrier for that young person, or even asking that question might be a barrier for that young person to engage in education. So yeah, I'm a bit on the fence on that one.
I feel the same way, Sarah. I do a lot of work with prisoners, and we talk about that chance to be able to access learning on the outside once you've paid your price, you've had your time. And it's hard to be able to step into any kind of institution, especially if the first question that comes is, have you got a criminal record? So I feel the same way as you. I think I understand from a safeguarding point of view why the college would do it, but I also think we could potentially be creating even more disenfranchisement from the system. I'm just going to walk away again if you ask me that question. I'm not even going to have a go. So it's a really, really difficult one, isn't it?
You know, trying to explain to a 16-year-old about rehabilitation of offenders, they're not going to get it. And them having the confidence to challenge a decision, they unless they've got parents that are able to facilitate that dialogue for them, they will just walk away, and then it's what happens to that young person.
Yeah. So is there debate about it insofar as some colleges are doing this and some aren't? Is there a forum where there can be some kind of national discussion about whether this is the right thing to do or not? Because it feels to me like it's the individual institutions having to make those calls, and where there's some national forum to discuss it, perhaps there could be some guidelines for organisations. What do you see any kind of support for organisations in making those decisions, Sarah?
I think it's basically down to DSLs about, you know, deciding the level of risk and whether they can or can't manage it. Now, we're fortunate that our DSLs have always been supportive and do want to encourage the development of, you know, young people and adults in terms of learning as a transformation. But all that takes is a change in who your DSL is and what their thinking is. As far as I'm aware, there's no national or even regional group where this is kind of being discussed. It's been very much, from what I understand, left to the institution to drive whatever change they want through. But I would welcome something regionally so we can look at patterns. Really, that's my concern, is to look at, you know, the impact. Is this having an impact on recruitment? And also, you know, if we can take the good bits out of that, you know, if we can celebrate those success stories as well of, you know, achievement and progression for those learners, because we haven't got the evidence really at the moment to be able to turn around to a learner and say, yeah, but this person did this and this is where they are now. You can overcome this, you can achieve, this is support we're going to give you, but we don't have that evidence. So starting from a baseline of asking for that, I think it's more at this stage going to be a barrier to disenfranchisement from education for those young people.
Yeah, we've got evidence if you enter education within prison, that can have an impact on rehabilitation because it's been funded for so long. There's had to be research studies to look at whether it's actually making a difference. But that's very different forms of evidence. That's when somebody's, you know, been through that side of the system. I think you're right. I think case studies, we learn through stories, don't we? And if we could gather some case studies that help to both tell college decision makers and organisational decision makers what difference it can make, but more importantly that young people can relate to.
If we can have that learner's journey evidenced, then that makes such a big difference, especially when you're going out and you're doing that recruitment at schools with your sort of year 11s or your year 13s. You can at least say, you know, if you've had these issues in the past, we will support you. Here is an example of the work that we've done. We can show you a positive destination.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to take, there's a head of wellbeing safeguarding at the Education Training Foundation called Teresa Carroll, who's such a good egg. I'm going to take some of this to her with your permission, because I think it would be really helpful. I hear what you're saying about regional would be the most helpful, but if there could be some kind of national forum that brings together people who are working at a regional level, I think that's something that Teresa might be open to. So would you feel okay if I was to share the slides that you've made today, Sarah, to see if...
Brilliant, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, it's just that I think...
No problem at all. So moving on, what we mean by county lines. So county lines is where a criminal gang set up a drug dealing operation in a place that's outside their usual operating area. So gang, they'll move their drug dealing from a big city, so Manchester, London, Leeds, Liverpool, to smaller towns in order to make money. So one example that I can give you is that there is a drug dealing gang in Manchester who flooded the market in Barrow-in-Furness, which we all know is a lovely little place in the Lake District. And they flooded it with heroin, cheap heroin at that, and it had a really big impact on the community within Barrow-in-Furness, and an increase in serious criminal behaviour, and the crime rates increased. In reality though, the county line's the marketplace and the telephone number that is facilitated by your youngers or your soldiers. And it's basically just the infrastructure for distribution. It's for delivering those drugs that are traded in the county line. You ring the number, you know, and they're quite clever. They will, when they're setting a new county line up, they'll do, you know, buy one, get one free deals or 2 for whatever. They work on the same premise as a supermarket would. So basically the mechanism that's used is to provide a distance and a control, but it's through those phone numbers. Those phone numbers are worth thousands of pounds. Yeah, if the young person disappears or, you know, is assaulted or the drugs are stolen, as long as they've still got that phone number, that's all they care about. They don't care about anybody who's facilitating that network. And it's basically a rapid response. As I said, they use the same model as a gig economy would, you know, they're like a Deliveroo or a Just Eat for drugs. So when we were looking at CSE in a county line, we are seeing that children and young people are increasingly being told to hide, so having to do it themselves, and they are shown or having drugs inserted either vaginally or anally to avoid detection. And this is referred to as plugging or packing. And the issue around that is obviously, you know, if you've got a child who has had drugs inserted, say they've had heroin inserted, if that package bursts, the time that it'll take to seriously damage that child or that young person is very quick in terms of, you know, to the size of a full-grown man. Young girls are often groomed and forced into relationships with gang members and made to perform sexual acts, and actually they pass girls around the gang. In terms of young women who have drug debts, they are forced in prostitution to pay those debts off, and they can be trafficked to other more urban areas to avoid detection. And as I said earlier, rape is commonly being used as a punishment for both young men and women who fail to do what they're being told by the gang, or if they've, you know, dissed an older gang member or that kind of thing. So looking at terminology, these are words to look out for when you're around your young people. So they may use the term county or going county or going country, sometimes they say. It's the most commonly used term to describe a county line, and it's the activity of travelling to another town or a city to move or sell those drugs. But it's not just drugs, it could be the weapons or the money. Trapping is the act of selling the drugs. It can also refer to moving the drugs from one place to another or selling them in that one location, and that one location would be a trap house. Yeah. In that building is the base where the drugs are sold, but sometimes they can be manufactured in there. So it may be, you know, that they're cutting cocaine up, or that they're manufacturing methamphetamine or crystal meth. And these houses are usually occupied by an adult and are either rented by that adult. However, the young people are forced to stay in those houses for a period of weeks at a time, and it's the young person who's selling the drugs, not the adult in that house. Cuckooing is where the gang target vulnerable adults, but also we're seeing more and more young people who live independently as well being targeted in order to exploit their place of residence, or for storing and selling drugs, or for accommodating or hiding gang members, weapons, or other contraband. Cocoon is about acquiring a physical resource, so access to the property or clean bank accounts, and that way they can stay, trade, deal, protect their material resources, so their weapons, or members avoiding arrest, or running prostitution from those addresses. As I said, young people can be the victims of cocoon if they have their own property, or they have the access, they have their own bank account. They also may be at further risk if they've got drug or alcohol issues themselves. So debt bondage. Debt bondage is basically about persuading that victim they owe you something. And that might be in, you know, in lieu of the goods that you've taken, or in terms of, you know, I've been giving you drugs for free, but now you need to pay me for them. Or it might be, I've bought you that bike, you need to do a favour for me. So it's that whole changing the mindset of that person that they owe for something. In some cases, debt bondage is actually organised by the gang to make sure they can't escape. I'm going to show you that when I've hopefully put the video on. So it might be that that victim has been given drugs or money to transport, and they'll be robbed by that other gang member. However, they'll have to work to pay the debt off. The gangs usually use debt bondage to coerce reluctant affiliates. So people who don't want to be gang members in illegal activity. So it might be they've asked them to store or transport drugs, and they will arrange for that to be robbed from them, and that way that they will then be called into debt bondage. So when we look at exploitation, we see significant signs, and there are a number of signs that are coming across all types of exploitation. There's a link, there's a HTML link in the presentation under types of exploitation. If you click on it, it'll take you through to a page where there's lots and lots of information to support you. So looking at those significant signs, it looks like they are instructed by another. Are they forced or coerced to carry out certain activities? Are they showing signs of abuse, whether it be physical, so bruises, you know, black eyes, that kind of thing. Cigarette burns is another one. Or psychological abuse. Are they withdrawn? Are they lacking in self-esteem? Do they seem that they're anxious or on edge all the time? Are they, you know, do they never have any money? Or are they walking around with lots of cash, you know? Have they got no contact with their family or loved ones? Are they distrustful of authorities? Have they made threats against family members or threats against you? Or have they disclosed that they've been threatened? In terms of, you know, in some cases it might be that they're not in possession of their own legal documents. So for example, when I was talking about the young Vietnamese men, they haven't got their passports, they have no identity documents. And for the young, we've got students in college who were found in cannabis farms, and they had to actually age them by looking at their teeth and taking their dental records to be able to say how old they were, as to whether they dealt with them as children under the law or as adults under the law. And also whether they were then classed as, you know, unaccompanied minors, or are they, you know, could they then send them back to Vietnam as an adult because they were here illegally. So in terms of sexual exploitation, things like, is the person being guarded closely? Signs of physical abuse, or the other one is tattoos. So there is actually, you know, certain gangs will have certain tattoos that will indicate their ownership. Is there evidence that this person is being intimidated or coerced? Do they have, if they're non-English speaking, can they only use like sexualized words? Do you see emotional trauma? In terms of properties, we look at things like letterboxes or doors to the property and being sealed from the inside, you know. Are people potentially being moved? So if you're seeing a large scale of people moving backwards and forwards, that kind of thing. When we look at labour exploitation, this is where the majority of young people who are caught on county lines, this is the route that what we see the police going down in terms of attempting to close down county lines and charge those elders or the organised crime. They're using this legislation, the modern day slave legislation, to actually go after these criminals. So, and the reason we fit it into this legislation is because it actually sits quite well around what we think of as county lines and those people exploited, because we've got the use of violence and intimidation and the accumulated debt. In terms of retention and identity papers or threat to exposure to immigration authorities, we find that very much so in looking at things like manufacturing, hospitality, you know, your car washes, your nail bars, but also in places where you wouldn't even think, like construction or factory work. A lot of, you know, gig economy type driving work, your Amazons, your one-man band kind of things. So we're seeing more and more of that as well. Then we've got domestic servitude. So, you know, this is just somebody who is made or forced to work in a private home in terms of looking after children or cleaning houses and that kind of thing. When we look at, when we look at forced criminality, which is what we would sit underneath that modern day slavery legislation, we see forced criminality can take many forms. So we've obviously got our county lines, but we also look at cannabis cultivation in there as well. We've got begging, pickpocketing, bag snatching, ATM theft and selling of counterfeit goods. And in terms of, you know, these people who are operating the drug trade, these organised criminals, they may have, you know, people who are bringing people into the UK that may also be organised into pickpocketing gangs or begging gangs, or that they are bringing counterfeit goods in to also be sold. So it's not just a county line, there could be other things sat around that in terms of forced criminality. The other thing is that we also see quite a lot of social welfare or benefit fraud. So it might be that, you know, the exploiters are actually falsely applying for benefits using that victim's details, whether it be universal credits, whether it be, you know, things like working child tax credits, or it could be things around sort of paying for accommodation. Or it may be just taking the benefits off the people. So in terms of, you know, you've got a vulnerable adult who's being cuckooed, they may be taking their benefits off them as well. So it's not just a case of it, they're there and they're making the money. They are also manipulating huge amounts of money out of the welfare state that is illegally being obtained. Unfortunately, it's not them that are charged with fraud, it's the claimant that's charged with fraud. So then that would be a barrier for that person to be able to ever get out of the situation that they find themselves in. So I am done. We've got just under 10 minutes. So has anybody got any questions? Do you want to put them in the, you just stick your hand up? I shall stop sharing the screen and then I can see you all.
Sarah, are you going to show that little video clip?
Yes, I will. I'll just put it in here and you can watch it at your leisure.
Right, lovely, thank you.
That's quite wise, Sarah, because it can be a little bit difficult with the audio, so that's quite a nice thing to do.
Plus, I apologies, because I just don't want to miss anything, because I've personally found it so sad, but really interesting and frightening as well, I've got to be honest. But yeah, but no, wonderful. I'm just looking at the questions. Yeah, your knowledge is outstanding on such an interesting subject. Will you be sending the PowerPoint out? We can sort that, Dipka.
Thank you.
To get it out, because obviously we've recorded it. I think our intention is that the recording will go on to YouTube. Is that correct, Claire?
That's right, if everybody's happy. I'm going to stop the recording now, so just in the spirit of that's a nice place to stop. So everybody who's listening to this after the session, we will make sure that we share some of the links that I know Sarah's sharing as well to video and things. Let me stop that now.